So it's time for us to read another book. I had a really hard time deciding on which book to read. There's so many great books out there. That's part of the reason. And especially books about Appalachia, there's so many great ones. And the other part of it is that sometimes I can be very undecisive, believe it or not. So finally I decided I should just pick one of my favorite books. Well, one of my favorite books about the mountains of Appalachia is Dory, Woman of the Mountains. It was written by Florence Cope Bush, who is actually Dory's daughter. It's a biography of Dory's life set in the Smoky Mountains. It starts when she was a small child and then leads through the rest of her life. The book actually spans from 1898 to 1942. And in her later years, after she was married, not really her later years, but in her married life, she married a man named Fred. We'll learn more about him as the book goes on, as we begin reading it. But he ended up being a logger during the boom time of logging in the early 1900s in western North Carolina. When you think about Appalachia and kind of the culture and a lot of the most common things that people know, a lot of times what comes to mind is coal mining, which is a really Appalachian thing, and there's that culture around it. But there are no coal mines in western North Carolina. There are some other mining. Of course, comes to mind really quickly for me is Copper Hill, the copper mine. I was born in Copper Hill. There was some other gem type mining, even some more mining for minerals and things that were used to build stuff. But in these days when this book was written, logging was one of the main cash incomes for people who lived in the mountains of western North Carolina and in other parts of Appalachia as well. And sometimes it was the first cash money that really people had. You know, even when my father, Pap, when he was a boy, he was born in 1937, even then in the mountains here in western North Carolina, he told me that cash was something they rarely seen. They didn't. He said maybe $40 a year would go through his mother and father's hands. That's not much money at all. Of course, it was more money in those days, but still not much. They really lived by the barter and trade. That was the way that they got things that they needed in those days. Dory, Woman of the Mountains was actually first printed in 1992, but since then it's been reprinted like up to 7 times. That's what a popular book it become. And I'm going to read you the little introduction by Florence Cope Bush, so that'll tell more about it. Since Dory's husband was a logger, that kind of plays a role. That logging culture kind of weaves its way through the whole book once you get past her childhood once she's married. But that really is part of probably why I was attracted to the book in the first place, because my Papa Wade was a logger. Other loggers, a lot of people that I've known here in Cherokee County where I live, there's people today that still are loggers. Pap, sometimes when I was a really little girl, he would work in between times he was driving a truck, he would log, he would do that too. So all those wonderful fond memories I have, I can never smell sawdust that I don't think of Papa Wade. And if I close my eyes, I can be a little girl sitting in his lap again, playing with his overalls where the sawdust, and on Pap too, where it kind of had, made little pools in their crevices of their clothes, maybe in their pockets. So all those wonderful memories really drew me to the book. But when you get to hear throughout the book how Dory looked at life. Once I read it, this was one of my main books when I think about the culture of Appalachia that really rings true. When I read it, I was like, yes, I understand that. Yes, that makes sense. Yes, she looks at things like I do, and I just felt this real kinship with Dory, even though we're definitely not of the same time period, not at all. But even all these years later, so many things in the book just rings true to my experience growing up in the Appalachian Mountains. Some of the chapters in this book are longer, so I'm not going to be able to read a whole chapter, so we'll have to divide some of them up like that. But today I'm going to read part of the first chapter, but I'm also going to read the introduction just because I think it gives a real insight into the actual writing of the book, why Florence Cope Bush decided to write it, and then also gives you kind of the background of what happens in the book. My parents, Dorie Woodruff Cope and Fred Cope, were part of the mass migration of people leaving the mountains when the government claimed their homeland to establish the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I was born in Tremont, a settlement between Townsend and Cades Cove. When they left their home, I was 3 years old, and I have no memory of ever having lived in the misty blue mountains, but everything about the Smokies fascinates me, and I'm ever drawn back to the place of my birth. My heart has always been in the mountains. Many summers spent with my grandparents on their farm in Sevier County, Tennessee, gave me a sense of relation to the mountains and their people. Granny and I spent evenings going through the family pictures and records she kept in a large trunk beside their bed. Even then, I felt a sense of loss because no one seemed to care about the lives these people had led, how they got to where they were, or that they even existed. Many years after the death of my grandparents and my father, I felt the familiar urge to go home to the Smokies. Knowing we were losing a part of our heritage, I spent 9 years talking to my mother, Dory, Woodruff Cope, about her childhood and the life in the mountains. Memories long forgotten surfaced as we moved backward in time. One thought led to another until we were back at the beginning of her life. Dory, Woman of the Mountains, was not written with the ideal that it would ever be published. I wrote it as a gift to my daughter, my mother, and myself. The manuscript was in my possession for 15 years before a friend talked me into letting him publish the 2,000 copies in paper book for local distribution. The impact of the book surprised everyone. Dory came to represent a female relative in almost everyone's life. So often I heard, "You wrote about my mother, my grandmother, my aunt." Much effort went into researching the accuracy of the events described in the story. My mother and I went through letters, pictures, often having valuable descriptive material on the back, her father's time books from the Little River Lumber Company, documents from Oconaluftee Township, North Carolina, and papers written by my father. I became a familiar patron in libraries and archives in both North Carolina and Tennessee. Finally, it all came together. With Dory, we returned to a time before the Outlanders' civilization slipped in through the door. Meager livings came from the isolated, nearly perpendicular farms in the coves and hollows. Money was almost non-existent, and food and clothing came from back-breaking labor on one's own land. Before mason jars were brought into the hills, food was dried or smoked. Clothing came from sheep, flax, and cotton grown on the farm. Great changes came with the lumbermen pouring into the mountains. As money became available to the Highlanders, old customs and ideals crumbled. Centuries-old arts and crafts were abandoned for modern methods. Why weave a basket when you could buy one? Wasn't a machine-made blanket better than a handcrafted quilt? Wasn't food in tin cans better than the home-dried or home-canned variety? As must always happen, the old gave way to the new. Now I would like for you to meet Dory. She probably will remind you of someone you already know and love. This is my mother telling her story as she told it to me. And that was Florence Cope Bush in November 29th of 1990. That was the introduction. So now we're going to start. This first chapter spans the time between 1898 and 1907. Before we start, I just have to point out, it's very common in Appalachia to change. So her name was Dora, but we changed that A to an IE and called her Dory instead. Another one that comes to mind is Sarah, often turns into Sari. I have a whole video about names that you can check out if you want to, but that's interesting that her name was actually Dora, but everyone called her Dory. So this is 1898 through 1907. My memory may be faulty at times, but I know this to be true. Ma and Pa did everything they could to make us happy and keep us clothed and fed with what was available to them at the time. They only had their own abilities and what the mountains provided. Some would say that was poverty, but we didn't think so. Like the Cherokee and early white settlers, they used knowledge that had been gathered since the time the area was invaded by man. Most everything we needed for survival was there in the mountains. Ma and Pa each brought their own experience and knowledge together to form our household. Although they were Appalachian mountaineers, they came from different backgrounds. Pa was Dutch and Ma was a fiery Scots-Irish and Catawba Indian mixture. All her ancestors had been in the mountains since they arrived in this land. In a way, she was more in harmony with the wilderness than Pa. The times we spent together are sweet in my memory. I especially liked fall. When the leaves on the hillside began showing their full blaze of color, we knew the cold, crisp air would come down from the north and remind us to get ready for winter. And oh, the harvest moon! At night it looked like a big ball of white ice floating in a sea of purple velvet. It shone so brightly that only a few stars were visible in its glow. From where our house sat between the mountain ranges, it looked twice the size of the moon that I see since I became older. In the fall, Ma, Pa, and we children picked up buckeyes and gave them away. By the time the old tree by the church had dropped most of its crop, the shiny brown seeds had shed their rough, prickly burr husk and were waiting to be gathered. The Indians carved decorations on them to make necklaces and other kinds of jewelry out of the hard brown shells. The only thing we did with buckeyes was give them away. They're not edible, but they make beautiful ornaments to have around the house. They were often passed down from one generation to the next. I still have my own lucky buckeye. It was Pa's, and it's over 100 years old. Courting couples sometimes opened the husk and each took one of the seeds. The buckeye is a symbol of love because two seeds fit together inside one pod, sort of like the Bible verse about marriage where two become one. I don't think Ma and Pa shared a buckeye. They were so different that they wouldn't have fit together in one pod. I've many times wondered what attracted them to each other. Pa was so gentle and kind and one of the few men I ever saw cry. He was born in hard times in Jackson County, but then everybody born when he was saw only hard work and sparse living in the road before them. Pa started to work as soon as he was big enough to handle a hoe or an axe. His family saw no need for education, and besides, it cost 60 cents a month to send your child to school. Back then, 60 cents was a lot of money. Because he couldn't read or write, he followed the timber cutters to Smokemont to work in a small sawmill. He didn't have to use his brain there, only his muscles. The hard work kept him gaunt and tired. Maybe fate stepped in and brought him and Ma together. He wasn't handsome, but he was pleasant, an upstanding young man. Being single made the local girls take notice, but he was shy. I've heard different stories about families offering him room and board or free meals if they had single daughters. Any girl would be lucky to marry him. Ma was a beauty with boundless energy and ambition, always going and doing. She had deep blue eyes and wore her long raven hair up in a bun on the back of her head. Fragile skin, the color of pink and white apple blossoms, covered a very strong-willed woman with a sharp wit and an equally sharp tongue. Pa always said half of the men in Swain County were afraid to speak to her because they didn't know what to do with a woman who spoke her mind. Back then, women definitely had a place, but Ma wouldn't stay in hers. She would outthink and outdo most of the men she knew. Because she was a year older than Pa, he always said that he saved her from Spencerhood by marrying her at the old age of 23. If a woman wasn't married early, the only thing left for her to do was to hire herself out to do most any kind of job, even servitude. Ma had done this since she was 13. She went to live with families when new babies were born or when there was sickness or death. Ma helped to prepare the bodies for burial. At this time, there were no funeral homes. The dead were washed, dressed in their Sunday best, and put into homemade coffins. Her pay was small, and sometimes it was trade or barter. She would accept food or cloth for payment. Ma never said why or how she had learned to read and write. Like Pa, she never went to school, but somewhere along the way, she taught herself the basics. It was easier for a woman to take a few minutes from chores to do some of the things she wanted to do. She never worked on a schedule like the men did. Ma had 5 sisters, and they were all very close. I know that they could all read and write because there are still letters from them in the family. Maybe as the oldest sister, she taught the others to write, or maybe they all learned together. They shared their lives with each other through the scrawly letters they passed around until they were worn and fragile. Concerning Pa, Ma had her own plans. She had seen him at church meeting and knew the tall, lanky man with the craggy face was the man for her. Pa must not have put up much of a fight for his bachelorhood, because they married May 26, 1898. Pa's adopted father, Coleman Mills, stood up for him at the ceremony. Her sisters and aunts planned a wedding charivari, but Uncle Aiden talked them out of it. The boisterous celebration didn't fit his way of thinking, or maybe he didn't want to endure the noisy festivities. The women banged the bottoms of pots and pans and marched around the bride. The groom was hoisted onto a log and carried around the house while the men teased him about getting caught by some woman. After the demonstration was over, they all went to the tables laden with desserts and coffee. The stack cake sitting in the middle of the table was the center of attention. Each lady attending the wedding had brought a layer to add to the cake. The filling was made from apples and molasses. The higher the cake, the more prominent and well-known the bride. Uncle Aiden said, "Why would you want to celebrate when you have just got yourself into trouble by getting wed?" With Uncle Aiden, you couldn't tell if he was joking or not. My great-uncle was a very strong, opinionated man. We shouldn't have been surprised that Uncle Aiden lived to be 101 years old. He had the determination to do it. Still, for all his gruffness, he was the most beloved member of the family. He believed in the rightness of the Baptist faith and practiced it. Everything he did was measured by the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Some of his beliefs must have influenced Ma. One of her first goals was to teach Pa to read and write. He refused to go buy the big red tablet and pencil. Ma got out her old slate and chalk to get him started. It wasn't long before she knew he needed the paper and pencil. With the slate, you write and erase constantly. She went to the store in Whittier to make the purchase and returned with more determination than before to make it work. They sat at a table he had made, in a chair he had made, and worked on letters and numerals he could barely scratch out. But finally, he learned to read and write and do arithmetic on his own. One day in the future, his skills would help him in building railroad trestles across the mountain in Tennessee. To show his grudging gratitude, he wrote Ma a poem in his imperfect handwriting. I do not write for joy, I do not write for fame. I rise because I love you, and you help me spell my name. Signed, R.V. Woodruff, 1899. Just a little footnote to his little precious poem that he wrote. He spelled right, R-I-T-E in it, R-I-T-E, and hope, help, but hope, H-O-L-P, very sweet. She kept it neatly folded, wrapped in a lacy handkerchief in the big family trunk. Pa was a proud man, and she knew it had been difficult for him to submit to her wishes. In her own way, she returned the favor by being a good listener. Pa could talk for hours about his father and how he came to the Smokies and how his parents gave him the name of a Confederate general. Pa's father came from Georgia during the Civil War and had served under the command of Robert B. Vance, one of North Carolina's favorite sons. But Pa never knew his father. He died of pneumonia in December before Pa was born in February. His mother had been given an order to name the baby Robert Vance if it happened to be a boy. The Woodruff family was Black Dutch. We never learned where they came from, but it's a term everybody in the mountains knows and identifies with tall, angular-featured people like Pa and Abraham Lincoln. Pa and Ma believed the story about Abraham Lincoln being the son of Abraham Enlow, a man who lived in the same area that they came from. As the story goes, Nancy Hanks, an orphan girl, was a worker in the Enlow household and became pregnant. She ran away to Kentucky, where she married Thomas Lincoln and gave birth to Abraham's child. It never seemed to bother them that history did not agree with their story. To them, Abraham Lincoln was an Enlow and Black Dutch. Some stories are too good to give up, and besides, Pa enjoyed looking like the president. I can't say if that is why he was a lifelong Republican or not. Whatever troubles their different personalities caused were solved once they were married. They worked too hard to have enough energy left to argue. There wasn't time to dwell on slights, real or imagined. Their time together was to last 48 years. Their first home was a one-room log cabin beside the Oconaluftee River. The rough cabin had a large fireplace used for both heating and cooking. The inside of the cabin was about 15 by 18 feet. Their only cooking utensils were a Dutch oven and a kettle or pot. An iron crane was fastened on hinges on one side of the fireplace so that it could swing over the fire. The kettle hung from this crane on chains or hooks. Roasting and baking were done in the Dutch oven, which had a cast iron lid turned up all around so that it could hold live coals of fire to heat the top and bake evenly. Pa made their furniture. Rough lumber, hewn smooth on one side, was used for a table. Chairs were made from maple limbs, bent and coaxed into shape. Ma used thin white oak splits for weaving the seats. In the other corner of the room, a double bed with a straw tick mattress filled most of the space. They didn't have springs on the bed. Pa used rope to make the bottom. They hung their clothing on nails driven into the wall. Everything else was folded and neatly stacked on shelves along the wall. Ma had made quilts and unbleached muslin sheets. When they were quite young, mountain girls started making quilts for their hope chests so that they could have the things necessary for their own home when they were married. Pa and Ma went to Whittier to buy dishes. After she unpacked and washed them, a set of snow-white dishes sat on the shelf near the door. Pa made a long box that stood on square legs. One side was for flour and the other side for cornmeal. Pa spent many long hours at the sawmill. Ma planted the garden and took care of the livestock. All summer she worked toward making the long winter a comfortable one. She preserved all the food, milked, churned the butter, spun and wove material for clothing, and then hand-sewed all that they wore except their shoes. All the energy she had used working for other people could now be used to make a home for her own family. When the first snow came, they were ready for the isolation it brought. Dried fruit, meat, and vegetables would easily take them through the longest winter. Pa would take his rifle to work sometimes and bring home a squirrel for fresh meat and gravy. By the last of November, Ma knew they should be parents by spring. She took special pride in making the baby's clothes. Delicate crocheted and tatted lace trimmed the bonnet and dresses. Several pairs of long white stockings were necessary because they were pinned to the baby's diaper and had to be changed every time the diaper was. They had bought soft flannel to make gowns and belly bands to wear around the baby's stomach. It was believed that a weakness in the stomach at the navel would cause a rupture if the baby didn't wear the band tightly for 6 weeks after birth. In the early spring of 1899, Pa decided to move closer to his job. He rented a small farm near the Cherokee reservation. They loaded their few pieces of furniture on a wagon and moved in time for spring planting. Ma worked along beside him until her time to give birth. I was born May 8, 1899, almost an anniversary gift to them. The Cherokee women were very curious about Pa and Ma. Many times Ma would look up and see a silent, unsmiling Indian looking in the window or open door. Sometimes when working outside, she'd catch a fleeting glimpse of them behind the trees. They watched while she boiled and washed the clothing in a big black wash kettle. The kettle sat on 3 rocks over a fire. Ma would bring water from the river to fill the kettle and then build a fire under it. Pa had driven 2 posts into the ground and stretched rope between them to hang the clothing out to dry. Some of the articles of clothing fascinated the Indians. They'd touch the white bran sack sheets and wonder about the use for such a big piece of cloth. Indian women washed their clothes in the river and dried them by draping them over rocks and bushes. It wasn't long before Ma could see clotheslines beside the Indians' cabins. Ma made friends with some of the women. They taught her how to make Indian bean bread and chestnut dumplings. The bread was made of cornmeal like cornbread and cooked and dried beans mixed into the dough. Chestnut dumplings were chestnuts covered with cornmeal dough, shaped into a ball, rolled in corn shucks, tied on each end with a strip of shuck, and dropped into boiling water. The Cherokees had many ways to eat corn. It was roasted, boiled, stewed, ground up, parched, popped, mixed with other vegetables and meat, and baked in many kinds of breads. Over half of the Indians' food was plant food. They favored deer meat and bear meat and caught fish with their bare hands. They tapped maple sugar trees for sweetening. This, along with wild honey, was used for trade. Scuppernong grapes, strawberries, huckleberries, gooseberries, crab apples, and persimmons were staples of their diet in the summer months. Persimmons were used with the corn to make a slightly sweet cake-like bread. There was one Cherokee delicacy Ma never tasted. They had a fondness for roasted wasp larvae. Finding a new wasp nest just before the young were hatched, they'd take a small stick and remove the white larvae and roast them over an open fire. It was considered an act of bravery to steal a nest from an angry swarm of wasps. In the early 1900s, it was still common for an Indian man to have more than one wife. Ma knew several families where there were 3 wives for one husband. The census taker said he had found one man with 6 wives. 2 seemed enough for most men. After Ma had won the friendship and respect of the Cherokee women, they began to share their legends with her. One woman told her, "At one time all living things were in the sky. On the sky rock, and this was before the world was made, all the animals could understand man, and man could understand them. Then man dishonored the privilege and was stricken deaf to the talk of animals and birds. The Great One, who was over the sky rock, punished man so that he could only understand the talk of his own kind." Ma loved to hear their stories. She had a great admiration for the Indians and said you could learn patience from them. They never hurried with anything. They knew it took time for the giant white oak to grow from a tiny acorn. There was nothing man could do to rush the growth of the seed planted in the ground. Time meant nothing to them. Man must wait for some things to happen. Worry and work could only accomplish so much. The rest was left to the Great One in the sky. Sometimes we unknowingly broke one of their taboos. The Cherokees never addressed another person directly. To do so was considered rudeness, which the Indian abhorred. This custom indicated reverence for another person's spirit. The spirits of humans and animals were holy to them. They always apologized to an animal they shot and wished its spirit a safe journey to where it was going. I didn't get to be the baby for long. My sister Lola was born October 2nd, 1900. My only brother, Luther Allen, was born April 8th, 1902. The last child, Lydia, was born December 7th, 1903. Ma always had a difficult time having her babies. A doctor was never in attendance at the births because there wasn't one in the mountains. Usually Ma's sisters or a midwife from the township delivered the babies. An Indian midwife delivered Luther. Pa gave her a pumpkin for payment. The Indians were fine herb doctors and kind, sympathetic midwives. From the beginning, Ma had been sick with her last baby. When her time came, Pa bundled Lola, Luther, and me up and took us up through the snow to Cousin Martha Carver's house about a mile up the Oconaluftee River. We didn't know Ma was going to have a baby. Pa told us she was sick and couldn't take care of us for a few days. Aunt Etta Maples came to help with the delivery, and she later told us about the birth. The baby was turned wrong, breech birth, I think. The labor was long and painful. Although the men were usually sent out of the house when children were born, Pa was afraid to leave Ma this time. He felt all along that she would have trouble. He held her in his arms when the pain twisted her body. Tears ran down his face and fell upon hers. In her agony, she thought his tears were raindrops and kept asking why it was raining in the house. After Lydia was born, Ma lay feverish and sick for many days. She had no milk for the baby. The fever had dried it up. Lydia was starving. Pa went in search of a wet nurse for her. Mountain women would sometimes feed someone else's baby when the mother couldn't give milk. He couldn't find a nursing mother, and Lydia grew hungrier and weaker. Ma couldn't get out of bed, and her mind still confused fact and fantasy. She didn't seem aware of the life and death struggle Pa and the baby faced. Pa tried to feed Lydia cow's milk and sugar warmed in a china cup set in the coals of the fireplace. He couldn't take her anywhere for medical help. She would have died from exposure in the below-zero weather. The nearest doctor was many miles down the mountain. I can still see Pa sitting by the fireplace, holding the tiny white bundle and trying to put drops of milk into the little mouth. He'd cry until the flannel was wet with tears. He gazed at the small angel face as if he knew he'd have to look at her enough now to last a lifetime. Her kitten-like cry would wake us at night. We knew Pa was still up, rocking her gently by the warmth of the fire. Lydia died January 1st, 1904. Ma's sister dressed her in a little white gown and bonnet Ma had made before she was born. Neighbors came and made the tiny pine coffin. They lined the inside of it with white flannel and draped black flannel on the outside. Friends and relatives dug the grave in the frozen ground and stood beside us when we gave Lydia back to God. She was buried just outside the Qualla Reservation. Later, when Pa and Ma had enough money, they bought a small tombstone for her grave. Sadness filled our lives for the rest of the winter. Ma wasn't well, and Pa's spirit was broken. We were separated from everyone. Pa couldn't go to work when the snow was so deep. We had our usual share of colds and croup. Ma, frail and unsmiling, used mountain remedies to treat our illnesses. She covered our chests with onion poultices and grease. If the congestion was bad, she gave us the usual 3 drops of turpentine or kerosene with sugar water. This always broke up the croup. Ma believed that the cough from the late winter cold would last until the leaves fell from the white oak trees in the spring. So we waited. Snow came 2 or 3 times a week to add inches to the blanket already on the ground. Silence hung over the mountains like a misty fog. Tree limbs snapped under the weight of snow and ice. The sharp, sudden noise echoed from mountain peak to mountain peak. Wind whistled around the corners of the cabin and down the chimney, causing the fire to reach out of the fireplace and fill the room with ashes. Ma kept beans and meat boiling in the kettle. The days, weeks, and months all seemed to run together. Every day was the same. Ma kept us fed, Pa tended the livestock and kept wood for the fire. Lola, Luther, and I made up our own games to pass the time away. Sometimes Pa sang a dreadfully sad song. It was called The Drunkard's Last Drink. And it goes, "One awful dark and stormy night, I heard and saw an awful sight. Lightning flashed and thunder rolled. It made me think of my poor soul. I dashed the drink down and left the place and went to seek redeeming grace. I went home to change my life and see about my darling wife. I found her weeping o'er the bed because our infant babe was dead. I took her by her little white hand. She was so weak she could not stand. I laid her down and breathed a prayer that God would bless and save us there. I told her not to moan or weep. Our little babe was just asleep. Its little soul had fled away to dwell with Christ in the endless day." Tears rolled down his face. Ma kept her sorrow inside. They grieved for Lydia in different ways. We never spoke of her, but her memory filled the house. Pa had said as they lowered the coffin into the ground, "She'll be waiting for us on the other side." Spring finally came. Pa and Ma felt better when they could work outside. We had very little money now. Pa hadn't been able to work because of the weather. Ma's hard work last fall had provided us with enough food to last until the garden came in. We still had dried beans, berries, corn cut off the cob, pumpkins sliced and strung on a string, and a little cured ham. Gourds hanging from wall pegs held the seeds for a new planting. Pa hunted squirrels and rabbits for fresh meat. Ma didn't like for him to bring in rabbits. People were dying from something called rabbit fever. Better to be hungry than dead, Ma said. It was a matter of pride with Pa and Ma that we have biscuits for breakfast. Cornbread was fine for the other 2 meals, but to eat cornbread for breakfast indicated poverty or laziness or both. Pa always said that while he was alive, we'd never have to eat cornbread for breakfast. Ice-cold milk and butter made the biscuits and cornbread taste like dessert. I was always anxious for the first day of May to come because Ma let us go barefoot after that day. Feet that had grown too big for last year's shoes were set free. Also, in preparation for spring, we were all lined up and given our spring tonic of sulfur and molasses. This was supposed to clean out our systems and get rid of all the winter wastes and diseases. As soon as the weather was warm enough, Ma took us to the banks of the Oconaluftee River, stripped us, took us one by one into the cold, clear water, and washed us with lye soap. The harshness of the soap and the cold water made our bodies turn rosy red. Our long braids were undone, and our hair lathered with the soft, jelly-like soap Ma kept in a pottery crock. Luther's golden curls picked up every ray of the sun after the last rinse. Rapunzel's golden hair couldn't have been prettier. Ma and Pa would bathe just before twilight. Ma kept on her white petticoat, and Pa wore his short one-piece summer underwear. They never bathed unclothed. The Oconaluftee River was sacred to the Cherokees, but Ma thought it was all right if we had our weekly baths in the crystal water. We won't dirty it much, she said. The Indians called the river, and there's no way I can say this, but I'll put it on the screen, Yanudeehuni, where the bears live. A family of water bears was said to live at the bottom of the river in a deep hole. Another part of the river was called, again, I probably can't say that, so I'll put it on the screen, but it meant where the bears washed. It was a deeper part of the river where all the animals came to wash and heal their wounds when they had been hurt by hunters. No white person had ever seen this place because evil had blinded us to its existence. The animals knew how to find it, and diving into it meant instant healing. Ma never believed any of these legends and said, "A river is a river." We called it the Luftee River, as most white settlers did. Spring was the time to renew old acquaintances with relatives and friends whom we hadn't seen since the first big snow last fall. Ma took us all to visit her Indian friends, all the while cautioning us not to eat anything offered. Their visits to our cabin became more frequent. Ma was afraid they'd steal her babies. Minnie had never seen babies with blue eyes. Luther had blonde hair to go with his bright blue eyes. They rubbed his head and talked among themselves about him. It's a jam-packed first part of this first chapter of Dory's life. So fascinating, all of it. Of course, there's the heart-wrenching story of losing the little baby because the mother didn't have milk, and the father trying to feed it. You know, that just stuck with them for the rest of their lives and weighed on them. Such a sad time there. The heartwarming story, though, of her teaching Pa to write, and him writing the little poem for her, and that she kept it wrapped up in a handkerchief for the rest of her life and held on to it. That's such a sweet, heartwarming story. A lot of the culture and the different things in this one, the words used and the kind of the description of things really rings true for me, having grown up in Appalachia. I find especially interesting the relationship between mostly Dory's mother, and the Indian ladies. How they were enamored with each other. They had never seen like someone hanging out clothes, and why would you need those clothes? And then her learning from them how to cook food for her family, how to utilize those wild foodstuffs that you can find, like the persimmons. Well, you can still find persimmons today. I was going to say the chestnuts that they talk about that you could find at that time. All those things that Ma learned from the Indian woman is really fascinating and neat that they made that friendship, and they had it to the point that they would go visit each other. But then the strange part is, then if they felt like that, then why there at the end she kind of says that she was afraid they would steal her baby. I don't really think they's interested in stealing her baby. I think, again, just like they were kind of enamored with the clothesline and the linens they had never seen, they were also enamored with a baby with blue eyes and blonde hair. So I think that's all that was. And in the same way that she was enamored by their legends, like she loved to hear those stories of the legends of the Cherokee, and they have some beautiful, amazing legends. If you've never heard them, you should definitely look that up. But I hope that you enjoyed this first part of the book. As it goes on, this is kind of just laying the background of Dory's life, how it started out. As it goes on, it's more about her than it is about the mother and father. Of course, at this point, she's still just a little girl, but still, that's where her life began, living there on the Oconaluftee River near the Cherokee. And it sounds like a really rough beginning so far, but I hope that you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment and let me know what jumped out at you from this chapter. And I hope that you'll tune back in next Friday, because we've got to see what happens to Dory, Woman of the Mountains, next.